It's impossible to change the law in one shot with one litigation that will change everything. People who litigate for social change know and understand, or at least should understand, that it is a step-by-step long way.
That was Israeli Supreme Court Justice and legal scholar Daphne Barak-Erez, drawing lessons about contemporary jurisprudence from ancient Jewish texts. Barak-Erez's newest book, Biblical Judgments, New Legal Readings in the Hebrew Bible, asks, what can the Hebrew Bible reveal about contemporary law and government, judging and judges, human rights and social justice? I'm Shana Hammerman, and this is Cite and Sound, the Stanford Jewish Studies podcast. Here we host conversations with scholars and artists as we explore Jewish scholarship, culture, and history. On today's episode, we welcome Daphne Barak-Erez, who joins Jewish Studies faculty director Vered Shemtov for a rethinking of biblical stories, both famous and obscure, and how they inform contemporary legal thought. And now, the conversation.
My first question for you, Daphne, is why write about the Bible? What led you to choose this topic?
Okay, so hello everyone. First, I must say how delighted I am to be here with you today as well. And now to your question. My approach to the Bible, or my choice to write about this topic, is in many ways very personal. My first encounter with questions of law and justice being brought up in Israel was biblical stories. And I want to stress that I did not grow up in a religious family, not at all. But in Israel, the Hebrew Bible is an important part of culture, of the understanding of our Jewish civilization in the broadest sense. So some of the stories that we may even touch upon in our conversation, like the trial of Solomon, these were the stories of my childhood. When I became a judge, it intrigued me. It was interesting for me to go back to my childhood stories and think how I perceive these dilemmas of law and justice from where I stand today. So I would say my direct answer, the most personal answer in this sense, this is also a personal book to the degree that legal books can be personal, but they can. But I must say that there is also an additional reason. The Hebrew Bible, again, not from a strictly religious perspective, this is not my perspective, is one of the greatest texts of Western civilization. It is a text that shaped minds, imaginations of people, not necessarily from Jewish ancestry. And I think that it's always helpful to think about basic dilemmas through the big text of our civilization. So I think that what brought me to writing the book was this combination between the personal and the universal.
Well, you mentioned the story of Solomon, so maybe we can start with that.
Okay, so the trial of Solomon, really, I think one of the notable stories of the Bible. But again, I don't want to give you a test, so I'll rehearse the basic text. Two women approach the big, wise King Solomon, as he is depicted by the text. They come with, I would say, a tragic story. Both of them were mothers to babies. One of them died. There is only one remaining baby. And each one of these women argued that the living baby is hers. And the King Solomon, who is again depicted by the biblical text as the wisest king, the wisest person on earth, has to decide in this very conflicted situation who is the real mother. And the story, presented traditionally as a great story of wisdom, and we will look into that in a minute. According to the story, King Solomon orders that the baby would be cut into two, and each of the women will get half of the baby. And then one of the women screams, "Oh, spare the baby. I don't want you to cut the baby." And King Solomon, the wisest of all, says, okay, she's the real mother, give her the baby. This is the story. It's very well known. I think there are also many drawings, famous drawings, where depict this dramatic situation. And the traditional reading of the story is that this is one of the ultimate examples for the wisdom of Solomon. And obviously, this is how I learned and understood the Bible back then. Now, when I go back to the story, and again, I don't want to read it against the text or it's against tradition. It just, I go back to the text with my additional perspective as a judge who has to decide in such dilemmas. And I ask to myself, can it be? Is this a wise judgment? Can we learn from such a judgment? And the answer is, I think, in today's understanding, obviously not. Would we like a judge who manipulates the parties in order to get to the right result? And more fundamentally, again, as a judge, I ask myself, how do we balance between the value of due process and the value of getting to the right result? Because this biblical story implies that the most important thing is the result. I mean, we are happy with the story as traditional readers because the king gets to the right result. He finds the real mother. I mean, this is the traditional understanding. But this is not right. We cannot endorse, we cannot accept, we cannot adopt a method of prioritizing the good result over basic concepts of due process. When parties come to a court, they don't expect to be manipulated. First and foremost, they expect a fair trial, and this is not a fair trial. So one important perspective for thinking about this story is, again, the value of due process and how to balance it with our aspiration to get to the truth. But this is only, I think, a part of the story because it has additional layers. I think it's also important to us to think why, from another perspective, why cannot we accept this as a good solution? And when we think about it, not only that it's not a moral solution, it's also not an efficient solution in the sense that next time, probably, this manipulation, we will not be able to pursue it again because once it was used, the trick is known to everyone and it cannot be rehearsed. So maybe this is another reason why not to adopt methods of manipulation over fairness and due process in judicial decision making. By the way, not necessarily we know who is the real mother in this story. All we know is that who was the woman who was willing to spare the life of the child. So if you want to go back to the story from the perspective of some of the dilemmas of family law, so it also raises question of what is the kind of parenthood that sometimes a court should prioritize, biological motherhood or maybe psychological motherhood, or the parent who will, in this context, will take into consideration the best interest of the child. Obviously, in today reality, probably we would practice DNA tests, so we would not need all this. But it is still interesting to think with the text about implications for other cases. Maybe last but not least, I will also, and this is another reading. By the way, in the book, sometimes I offer several readings of the same story for different purposes. So another possible reading of the story refers to the fact that we don't know much about the biographical background of the parties. The names of the women who come to the king are not known. We don't know anything about them. By the way, interestingly, usually in today's legal system, we mention the precedents by the name of the parties. Here we don't know what are the names of the parties. We only know the name of the judge. So another question, whose trial is it? The trial of the judge or the trial of the parties? But anyway, the only biographical detail that we know about the parties is that they are defined as prostitutes. Very interesting. We don't know anything about them, but according to the story, it's not a story about two women who come to the court. If you go back to the text, I don't think this was read to me in my childhood, but if you go back to the text, it is a story of two prostitutes who come to the king. And I think that when we get a text that is so concise, when so many details are mentioned, it's very important to think why this detail was mentioned or omitted. On the pragmatic level, we can maybe speculate that this detail was relevant in order to understand the background, the factual background, because in those days, women usually did not live alone. So only because they were prostitutes and therefore probably lived outside the patriarchal order. So for this reason, no one knew who is the mother of the child. So this is a more, I would say, simple reading. But if we want to read further or think with the text further, and this is, I would say, my normative reading of this text, I would say that we learn from this text that even prostitutes could get to the king and get a judgment. So this is also a story that tells us something about the importance of access to justice, and that everyone, even back then, could get even to the Supreme Court at the time. I suppose that King Solomon was the equivalent of some kind of Supreme Court, and get justice.
So maybe we'll move from this to another story, perhaps a story of injustice, the one about Navot, Israel.
Okay, so I think that what is interesting about the Bible, what makes it a unique text, is that it's not only a text with nice stories. It also has many problematic stories full of dilemmas, sins in the sense of moral sins that should disturb us, that should call us for rethinking about the human condition. In fact, many of the stories are of this sort. I mean, the trial of Solomon is one of the more optimistic stories, although, as I tried to argue, it is more complex than may seem at first sight. But many other stories are indeed stories that we go back to, not necessarily in order to adopt or support, but rather to learn from mistakes, and sometimes even more than mistakes. But as I said, moral sins in the human sense. So for this reason, I would be very interested in following your suggestion to mention the story of Naboth, another person mentioned in the Book of Kings, less well known. So I have to share with you the tragic facts of his life, and especially his death. Naboth was an owner of a vineyard in the northern parts of the land of Israel. He probably had a wonderful vineyard. Why do I say that? Because this vineyard was so wonderful. So when King Ahab, one of the kings who's considered one of the bad kings of the Bible, although from historical readings and archaeological findings, we know today that probably he was one of the great kings of Israel, but in the Book of Kings, he is not a positive figure. And King Ahab sees the vineyard of his neighbor. It's a vineyard neighboring the royal palace, and he offers to buy the vineyard. Naboth cherishes his vineyard also mainly because it's the land of his ancestors, and he is not willing to sell. Okay, this is only the beginning. Ahab go back to his palace. He's a bit distressed by the refusal to his proposal. He goes back home and he tells the story to his wife, Queen Jezebel, another figure not very liked by the biblical text. And she tells him, "Oh, you don't know how to be a king. I suggest that you go take a rest and I'll take care of the situation. And indeed she does. She writes a letter on the king's behalf. She sends the letter, and here we will soon get to a story of judging, because I'm interested not in the drama, but rather in the judging. But I need to give you the background. She sends a letter to the elders of the neighboring town. The elders of the neighboring town are the judges of the time. They are the ones who have to decide, who have the responsibility of deciding legal cases. And she tells them, you should summon Naboth to trial, accuse him in false accusations, bring false witnesses against him, and find him guilty and execute him. That's the queen's order. And what happens, believe it or not, this is exactly what happens. The elders of the city are willing to abide with the royal order that they got, and Naboth is brought to trial, found guilty, executed. It's not a matter of retaliation. This method, this legal method that the queen wanted to follow had a very practical reason. The practical reason was that, according to the laws of the time, a person who was executed in this manner, his property goes to the king. And this is what was the original wish of the royal family. And this is exactly what happens. So this is a horrible story of murder, lies, taking of property in the most unjust manner. And the ending of the story is that Prophet Elijah, who is one of the positive and highly regarded figures of the biblical text, comes to King Ahav and tells him, you committed a horrible sin, and for this reason you're going to die, your whole family is going to die, and you are going also to lose the kingdom. I mean, the details are especially horrible about the dogs licking his blood, so we'll not get into this. The story is also very well remembered because of the very powerful words of Elijah, who accuses the king in both killing and inheriting. I mean, how come that you kill and inherit? This is the story. Now, what do we do with it? On the first level, there is the traditional reading, the reading that I'm not the first to propose, and that has become part of the tradition of Western law. And by this, I mean that this idea, this moral, I would say, principle, that a person who kills another individual can never inherit him. I mean, that this would be against the basic principles of justice. And for people who are familiar with some of the big known precedents of American law, so we can remind ourselves that in the 19th century, the New York Court of Appeals was encountered by a similar situation where a grandchild was involved in the murder of his grandfather. And the question that came to the New York courts was whether this grandson can inherit the grandfather. At the time, the American legislation did not address specifically this horrible situation. It was not envisioned. And the New York Court of Appeals had to ask itself. The precedent is known as Riggs v. Palmer, for people who are familiar with the American law. And the New York Court of Appeal had to decide whether it's going to decide the case according to the black letter, the formal provisions which would lead to inheritance in this case, or maybe follow another moral principle. And the New York Court of Appeals, interestingly, refers to this biblical story to prove that this would go against the basic concepts of justice, and this inherited the grandchild. This is, by the way, an interesting example for a specific norm that was adopted from the Bible, by the way, not from the legal part of the Bible, but rather from the more narrative parts of the Bible. It's the Book of Kings. It's not biblical law in any sense. It's just a moral teaching that was taken from the text by way of inspiration. Okay, this is interesting, this is relevant, but I think this is not the most important reading of the story, at least from my perspective. I mention it because it is important, it is part of the history of Western law. If I go back to our introduction, why did I pick the Bible? Not only for personal reasons, it's also part of a broader heritage. But the way I read it, in a way that may be closer to things that I think about in my everyday judicial practice, and I think that we should all think about, because, is that for me, this is a story that tells us or teaches us the importance of judicial independence. And in what sense? Because this evil story could happen, could materialize only because of the fact that the judges were willing to follow the dictates of the government. I mean, this is a story that shows what happens when the judges are not independent, when there's no separation of powers, when there is a willing to surrender to the dictates of power. Because what's really shocking about this story is not the fact that this is a story of killing and inheriting. Obviously, this is horrible. But what is more horrible is that this is not a regular or simple instance of a murder. This is an instance of a judicial murder that could happen only because of the willingness of the judges to accept dictates of tyranny. And I think that in this sense, this is the more important or the more general reading of the story that goes beyond the contours of inheritance law, important as it may be.
I would have liked to stay here and ask you a few more questions, but I'm going to stick with a book for now and ask you to share with us one more story, and then we can maybe move to other questions. You have a lot of stories about women. Well, the first one was also related to women, but maybe you can share with us one more. The book that just came out in Hebrew, your last book in Hebrew, is about women law, right? So maybe we can focus on that for a little bit and then expand it perhaps beyond the book.
Okay, so thank you. I think reading the Bible also from a gender perspective is very important, especially because we know that due to the circumstances of the time, I mean, the Bible is a book situated in a certain period in history and civilization. And obviously, gender equality is not the leading principle of the Hebrew Bible as much as we may like it or learn from it, but this is something to acknowledge. And the question is, what do we do with it? How do we learn from the dilemmas of gender justice and injustice that are found in the text in order to think about the relevance of some of these dilemmas for today? For me, going to the Bible is not necessarily in order to adopt a certain specific solution. I mean, maybe in the last story, it was also about adopting the biblical conclusion as such, but sometimes we may not be interested in the specific teaching, but still the text would be relevant, important, intriguing because of the dilemma that it sets. So going back to the text is not necessarily for adoption of specific solutions, but it is always interesting and relevant in order to think with it and even take its challenges in a way that will be relevant to us. So in this sense, and from this perspective, I was also looking in the text for stories of women, more specifically of women in the legal system. Women as litigants, obviously the story of Solomon is one of them, but there are also other stories of women as litigants. And it's interesting to see who are the women litigants, what kind of cases they bring to the courts of the time, what kind of arguments, and do they succeed in getting redress? So in this context, I would like to pick one of the well-known stories that I think that has much relevance for understanding the advantages of and disadvantages sometimes of litigation for social change, and this is known as the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad. I'm sorry, this is a very difficult name, but this is the name mentioned in the story. Before that, I will just still half a minute and say that there are several stories of litigants, of women litigants, which is interesting as such, but there is only one story of a woman judge in the Bible. So just to put things in context, probably at least some of you may remember that the only woman judge in the Bible is the prophetess Deborah, mentioned in the book of Judges. And I think it's worth saying just one thing about her, and then I'll go back to the litigants, because we should also give some respect to the judges, not only to the litigants. The book of Judges in the Bible is a book dedicated not necessarily to judges, which is interesting. I mean, the judges in the book of Judges are mostly military leaders who come to rescue the people of Israel when they have problems with the enemies in the borders. This is the pre-kingdom years, so there is no king, and whenever there's an issue, a problem, persecution, so a leader emerges, and the leader is known as a judge, although he's usually not really a legal judge, but rather someone who takes care of his people. Among the judges, the only woman judge is Deborah. And what's special about her that she is also the only judge who is really a judge. I mean, in the story, in the book of Judges, it is mentioned that Deborah sits under the palm tree, and the people of Israel go to her in order to bring their cases. So, and this is very interesting that from all the judges that we hear in the book of Judges, there's only one woman judge, and she's also the only true judge. I mean, this is her power, the power of justice, who is being recognized by the people. And we should ask ourselves, well, if she was so successful and so well respected, so how come that we had only one woman judge in the Bible? And the answer is probably that these were the times before the kingdom, before things got into order. So women who were capable could prove themselves and could be respected once the kingdom was in place. So the patriarchal order was already in place as well, and there was no place for women judges at the time. But let's go back to the litigants. So the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad is a story that even goes more back in history. We are talking about the times of the people of Israel wandering in the desert after Exodus on their way to the land of Israel. And they wander in the desert for 40 years. And in those 40 years, many things happen. One of the things that they do is prepare to enter the land of Israel, and there is a whole system of allocation of the land between the families. Each head of a family is entitled, will be entitled to get a piece of land in the future when they get into the land of Israel. And what happens? One of these men who is supposed to inherit a piece of land in Israel, he dies in the desert. And he leaves 5 daughters with no male heir. He doesn't have a son, only 5 daughters. And according to the law of inheritance of the time, only men can inherit. So the practical result for these 5 daughters is that they are left with no property because they are not entitled according to the laws of inheritance. So we have another story of inheritance laws. They are going to be left with no inheritance and therefore also with no probable economic support to support themselves. They are very unhappy with this result, and they decide to start a litigation. I mean, by today's standards. They bring their case to Moses, who is the leader of the nation, and they say, this is not right. We are left with no supporter, and there is no way, we don't have a brother, so it's not right that we will be left with no family property in these circumstances. Moses is perplexed. It's not clear what to do with such a thing. There's the divine law, and the divine law states that women don't inherit, he brings the case to God himself. He tells God, okay, we have a problem here. And God gets back to him and says, it's very helpful when it's possible to get a direct answer in this manner. And God answers, yes, they are right. They should inherit. They have a case. You should go back to them and tell them that they are right. And according to the biblical story, the petition of the daughters of Tzlofchad is accepted. And from then on, and this is, I think, the interesting part of the story, not only that they inherit, but the biblical story goes on and educates us or tells us that this has become a precedent for future generation. The text itself mentions the word precedent. So not only we have a correction of a personal problem, what we have here is litigation that brings about a change in the law. I think this is an interesting early example for litigation for social change. I mean, an individual is faced with a problem. There is no direct remedy or solution in the law. The way to challenge the law is to bring the case to the court. At the time, it is the leader, but he functions in his capacity as a judge, and the case and the litigants win. Is it an optimistic story or only a bittersweet one? I would say a bittersweet one, and even bittersweet with some emphasis on the bitter, despite what I've said so far. How come? I mean, it seems as though this is a story of a great success. But when we dig more, when we think more about the story, we learn that the laws of inheritance were not really changed. They were changed only in one particular case. When a man dies and he doesn't have sons, in this particular case, women can inherit. The law of inheritance in its entirety has not been changed. I mean, the rule remains that only men can inherit. As an exception, women can inherit if there is no male heir. So there is progress, but it is a very limited progress. So what do we do with it? I think this is a very realistic story, even if we think about it in today's understanding about litigation for social change. Because we know that when litigants want to challenge the law, it's impossible to change the law in one shot with one litigation that will change everything. People who litigate for social change know and understand, or at least should understand, that it is a step-by-step long way, that in order to change the law, in order to bring about to a bigger change, we should go to the court, but also understand that not necessarily they will succeed in one time to change everything. And this is also part of the limitations of litigation for social change. Not everything can be done also through courts. Sometimes we need bigger reforms to be pushed forward through political mechanisms by legislative reform. So I think that what's interesting about the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad is that it includes all this complexity. On the one hand, it's an optimistic story. Change can be brought about. On the other hand, it's also a very realistic story. Changes in the law are not miracles. They have to be worked for, and sometimes worked for with a lot of investment and vision for the future.
Thank you. I think that these three stories that you've shared with us give us a sense of the way that you are moving from the story to legal reading of it to some kind of a more general argument. Just to take it from the book to Israel of today, as somebody who's working on Hebrew literature, the centrality of the Bible in Hebrew literature. And when I listen to politicians, I hear the centrality of the Bible in political statements and speeches. Where do you meet the Bible, not the biblical law, but the biblical stories in your own work?
I was raised up and I live my life in the Jewish civilization. Living in Jewish civilization in the broad sense, also in the secular sense, means that our old texts are part of our world of imagination. This is part of how we think about the world, alongside other sources of inspiration. So when I think about the Bible, it's part of me as a human being, but alongside other moral teachings, theories, all the other things that enrich our lives. As a judge, by the way, obviously, I'm committed to the law of Israel, which is basically secular legislation that is enacted by the Knesset, subject to some exceptions made for family law, etc. This book I wrote not in order to practice it in my daily practice as a judge. I wrote it in order to think with it more broadly about questions of law and justice. It's not a codex to be implemented in my judicial everyday work.
We're getting to the end of the conversation, and the last question that we always ask our guest is if you could share with us a quote from a Jewish text that you find especially relevant to the current moment.
I would like to go back here to the story of Solomon. Before the dramatic part describing the famous trial, we are told that King Solomon falls asleep, and in this mode, he asks from God a discerning heart to judge your people. In the original Hebrew text, the message is stronger. Solomon asks for lev shomea, which would translate to a hearing or listening heart. I prefer this nuance because it focuses on a quality that is essential to judging, but in fact is essential to human relations everywhere.
Whenever I think about the Bible, I think about the people that judge there. And listening to you, I realized that, well, it is a book, and as a reader, I am the judge too. And so of what we got is your kind of reading as both a reader and a judge. So thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today's episode was produced by me, Shayna Hammerman, with help from Eva Clem. Sound editing and design by Romy Kiorian. Original music is by Jeremiah Lockwood. Cite and Sound is a production of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford.
Stanford University.